Welcome to Off the Page, the show where we talk with Colorado authors to get the story behind the story. I'm Stacy McKenzie, a librarian here at Maybe Dowd Eisenhower Public Library in Broomfield. And today we have Karen Douglas, author of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry books. Karen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And we're going to talk about all of your different genres of writing, which is just fascinating to me and probably a lot of people who even write. But first, I always like to ask, are you an author full-time or do you have another career?
I don't now, but I did.
Okay.
I was a psychiatric nurse.
Oh, wow. Did that have any influence on your writing?
Not in a direct way. People are always saying, oh, you must have a wonderful stash of stories to tell, but there's a line there that I don't cross because of privacy issues. However, understanding human behavior is definitely a plus for a writer, especially one who tends to start with characters.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So, in that respect.
I'm going to ask you a question you may not want to answer, but have any of your characters been based on people you encountered during your career? Not
directly, and I think like many writers, I mean, when you're creating a character, a fictional character, it's a composite.
Okay.
You know, you might take a behavior here, a setting there, put them together and come up with something totally new. That's really how I define creativity. When you see a connection that nobody's seen before, you put these two things together and you've got something that never existed.
Well, speaking of fiction and that type of combination, The Accidental Child, that's your fiction work that you're showing us today.
Correct.
You have other works of fiction.
I do.
But tell us a little bit about Accidental Child. What's that about?
It's a little hard to describe. I tend to put it in the genre of speculative fiction.
Okay.
Because there is a time travel element in it.
Yeah.
I don't ascribe it to science fiction because there's not a lot of science in it. It's futuristic. It posits a post-apocalyptic world after climate change has both decimated the human population and really desertified, if I can use that word.
Sure. You're an author. You can write up. You can make up your own words.
That's my own word, right? What we would call Middle America. I can tell you exactly where I was, though, when I got the first inkling that this was going to be a book. I've always been fascinated with architecture. And in Portland, Maine, which is my original hometown, we have probably one of the oldest enclosed shopping malls in the country, and it's still going strong. I was sitting in the food court one day and thinking, this can't last forever. What is going to happen to this mall in the far future? What if people lived in it? And that was the starting of it, throwing my mind way into the future. It's no longer a shopping mall. Now it's an enclave for survivors of climate change.
Wow. I would think a lot of people would love to live in a mall, but perhaps not after climate change.
Right.
And did you use any resource materials to give you an idea what it might be like after a climate change, or is it all just creatively done?
Most of this one is made up.
Okay, because we don't really know.
We don't know. However, I'm very interested in climate change. I'm very concerned about climate change. And if there's an ulterior message or ulterior motive to this book, it would be to have other people say, life will not be as easy, life will not be as I know it. It is not the kind of post-apocalyptic book that we're seeing many writers come out with. Cormac McCarthy's The Road comes to mind. He posits horrible climate change, and it's very dark. It's very dark. This book is not that dark. There are some things those people do that perhaps we could benefit from. They have a wonderful policy about caring for their sick. They grow their own food. They recycle because they have to, because there's no manufacturing anymore.
Yeah.
So it's a small, compact, highly stratified, because they have to be very careful with their resources.
So interesting, post-apocalyptic, but not as dark as we see
Correct.
other post-alarm
Correct.
pop. Wonderful, interesting. Well, okay, because this book is so different, and you even paused while you were classifying it. Who would you say is a good ideal audience for this book?
Oh, that's one of the hardest questions anybody ever asks me.
Well, I tried. Good.
It has a female protagonist, which suggests that probably women are more likely to read it than men, although men who have read it have appreciated it.
Okay.
So it's by no means a woman's book.
Okay.
I have to say two of my favorite authors are Margaret Atwood and Marge Piercy, who almost always write about women's issues, and they do it in highly imaginative and in a variety of ways. So I'd like to think that it's literary in that respect. So somebody who reads literary fiction, is an adult, probably a woman.
Okay, great. Okay, that's
half the population.
I
I'm
know,
happy with that.
I love it. That covers a lot of people. Would teens like it, do you think?
I
Young
think they
adults?
might. I think they might. It's some of the issues are a little subtle.
Mm-hmm.
The title comes from what has become a theme for me, and I didn't know that until after I had written this book and then looked back at some of the other things I've written. I think a great many of us are accidental children.
Mm-hmm.
And teens are acutely aware of how they fit into a family or feel that they don't fit into a family.
Mm-hmm.
So in that respect, it could happen. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And the language is pretty straightforward.
Well, that accidental child sounds fabulous. Let's talk about your nonfiction book, which I just think sounds great. So many people love to read about food and different things, and your book is called Feed, Reading Lists for People Who Eat. Tell me a little bit about this book.
As a librarian, you should love it. Basically, it's a bibliography.
Oh, great, wonderful.
When I first came to Colorado almost nine years ago, one of the early things I did was to take a course up at Naropa. Mm-hmm. As a poet of my generation, the beats were our grandfathers, our fathers, our sponsors, and to walk the grounds that Allen Ginsberg walked was something I had to do.
Aww.
It so happened that I had just read Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma and Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle, A Year of Natural Living, I think is the subtitle. So I was very aware of food issues. The woman with whom I studied at Naropa encouraged us to put our poetry in service to an issue. And my issue became our food supply. And the more I thought about it and the more I read around in that field, I realized there is such a wealth of material. It would be useful to other people to know. And I categorized things. You know, there are what I call food heroes, which would include people like Michael Pollan and Eric Schleicher, Fast Food Nation, those kinds of things. Okay.
Great book.
Yeah, great books. So that's how that one came about, and it probably needs to be updated at this point because every time I turn around, I find more material.
Yes, but you've also got fiction books in there.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So
there's
not just nonfiction, but literature.
There's one of my favorite books is Émile Zola's The Belly of Paris.
Ooh.
And his opening scene is about a man who is starving and is picked up by a woman who's on her way to the famous old Paris food market. And it's just, it gives me goosebumps to
I'm
think
getting
about.
goosebumps myself thinking about it.
Yeah.
So it's got a little bit of something for everyone. If you
Right.
like food, you're going to love these lists. And even magazines.
Magazines.
That was very impressive to me that you've got that in there also.
Websites, organizations, poetry about food. I think I had mentioned to you in conversation previously, one of my favorite poets is a woman named Diane Wachowski, and her collected poems is called The Butcher's Apron, and she writes a lot about food. It's just gorgeous.
So anyone would, and we get a lot of requests as librarians for food books, so this would be a great place for people to start and take a look at.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So before we move on to your third genre, which is poetry, I want to ask you, between fiction and nonfiction, how do you approach them differently? This is a bibliography, but you have other nonfiction works.
I do. You know, writing is writing, and good writing is fun.
Yeah.
I write a lot. And
Obviously, yes.
a lot of it is what we would call practice. So, you know, it's sort of like a dancer. You know how to waltz, but you maybe also know how to tap dance. It's all dancing. It's all dancing. It's all writing. You just sort of focus in a different way.
What a beautiful
Does that answer it?
analogy. Oh, yes, and
Yeah.
it's just a beautiful analogy.
Thank you.
And with the dancing idea, we'll move on to your poetry, because I
Okay.
very much see that as, how does your poetry fit into your other writing?
Well, the book of poetry that I accomplished because of that time at Naropa is called The Great Hunger, and all of the poems in there relate somehow to our relationships with food, with the food supply. My family is largely Irish immigrants, and they made it to the U.S. because they survived the famine, which was called the Great Hunger.
Okay.
And that just fascinates me, that I came so close to not being here because 1 million people starved to death in Ireland during the middle of the 1800s. And that kind of focused me on that. And it brings me to the point, I like it when genres sort of meld, okay? And this little poetry book that I brought, Two Gun Lil, is really a hybrid of poetry and memoir, which is another thing that I enjoy writing but haven't published much of other than in this. So, you know, we write from what we are, from who we are. And that's how I do it. These are things that I'm interested in. That's what I write about.
And that's so exciting, and so many people would like to do what you do. What I'd love now is to perhaps hear a reading from your poetry book. Could we do that?
Oh, I think we can.
Fabulous. Would love to hear that.
This, for people who are not poetry readers, this is a chapbook, C-H-A-P. You probably know the origin of that, but it came about because in England people would publish these little, what we'd almost call pamphlets, and there were chaps on the street who sold them for very little money. So poets kind of appropriated that name, and a short collection of poetry is a chapbook. And this poem, I think, will illustrate that business about family history and memoir and poetry. I don't write structured poetry, folks, so if you're looking for rhymes and sonnets, you're going to have to look somewhere else. This poem is called Scattered. They told Grandpa that western gates had no place in Maine. The big gate down the driveway fell the first winter, lost an argument with a wing plow. Now a road sign bears his name, Boyd Lane, off Durgantown Road between Cornish Village and the McIntosh Orchard. The Wolf River tree still stands alone by the brook, but I never knew who built the 12-room cape, who first mowed our hayfields and fenced the pasture easing up the south slope of a mountain with stooped shoulders, mediocre soil, who first tapped the sugar maples, planted and pruned the cherry, peach, and crabapple trees, or whose team dragged the 2 5-foot granite slabs and stacked them as steps up to the wide front porch. We lost the place, house, shed, barns, all burned. Then a hauled-in house went up in flames. Finally, the bark on the old maples cracked, went buggy. I moved west to a house that Jack built, facing a lake that Jack built, shallow, girdled with cottonwoods, a place of rabbits, coyotes, sweeping tall clouds in dry air in high summer. A world called Front Range, every inch measured, owned, graded, and abraded. We visit and move on. Beneath it all, the land endures.
That's lovely.
Thank you. So we went from Maine to
Yes.
Colorado.
And such a passage of time. You took the reader on a passage of time with that. That's really wonderful.
Thank you.
Now, Karen, I consider you an expert on writing with all these genres of books. What advice would you give to aspiring writers?
I think you have to experiment a lot. You have to figure out whether you're a hockey player or a figure skater, you know? And that takes writing practice. Those dancers I mentioned,
Yes.
practice.
Yeah.
Those skaters, practice.
Yes.
Musicians, athletes. Why would writers not practice? And you can practice with short pieces. You can scare yourself silly and say, I'm writing a novel, and you're probably not going to get it done because that's a huge project. Start with small chunks, okay? I'm going to write a scene. I'm going to write a character sketch. I think I want to write a family history, and I want Great Aunt Polly to be in it. And what do I know about Great Aunt Polly? Okay, I have a Great Aunt Polly, and I have, in fact, I think it's still up on my website. There's a story called Polly's Story. She was a character. Everybody in the family told stories about Great Aunt Polly. You know, there's a lot of advice out there about write what you know. That can get a little dull. I think you need to write what you would like to read.
Okay, yes.
And I think you have to push yourself a little bit to write something you don't know completely. Okay? Because it's in those synapses that you never thought went together that the real creativity comes.
Agreed.
You know?
Yeah, definitely.
Read some craft books. Hang out with other writers. I mean, my goodness, that's crucial.
Oh, yes.
That's crucial.
And can you tell us about some groups that you belong to? And I know that you have some.
I do.
So tell us about a couple groups that you hang out with other writers.
All right, let me see. Where shall I begin? One of my favorites is the Lighthouse Writers Workshop in Denver. They've been around for a long time. They do an excellent job. Membership there includes some freebies, or you can spend some money on specific workshops. And several years ago, I started with them, and I did what they called their novel boot camp, which was 2 full weekends. You went for a weekend, you were taught, you went home, you wrote for a week, you came back and brought what you had produced, and it really worked well.
Yeah.
I go twice a month to what they call their Friday 500s, and it's sitting for an hour with other writers. Nobody speaks. You sit and write. And then the second hour, there's a discussion or an exercise or something going on. The Boulder Writers Workshop, which seems to be on hiatus at this moment, but has been very helpful. And in fact, Accidental Child won a first place in their speculative fiction category last year.
Congratulations.
I guess it was this year. Goodness.
Speculative fiction.
Yes.
Excellent.
They do all kinds of workshops. They do salons where a writer will come and talk about his or her book. I hang out with a group of poets. We've been critiquing each other's work every week for years, which means you come either with a revision or a new piece every week. That keeps you honest. And these people are not, they're not nice if they don't have to be.
But
They
you
will
know
tell
each
you.
other.
We know each
Yeah.
other. And they know a lot about poetry.
Yeah.
So when they say, gee, I don't get the structure of this, or this line doesn't work, or why did you choose that word? You know, why did you break the line there? You listen.
Yes.
So that's Lighthouse, Boulder Writers, the Poetry Critique Group. I co-host an open mic poetry reading at the Cannon Mine in Lafayette once a month. My co-host is Larry Lavadeur, and we always have a feature. This month we had a gentleman come in and read us Russian poetry in Russian and then in English. That was great fun. And in September we'll have a Denver poet, Elliot Wilson, will be back with us. He'll be doing a reprise because we liked him so much. And it's open mic. And you don't have to bring your own poetry. If you just like poetry and you want to hang out with poets, you can bring anybody's.
Oh, that's
fabulous. We've had people do Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson and whatever you like.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I teach 2 private groups.
Wonderful.
So that's hanging out with writers.
Yes, definitely.
You know, and that means once every week I'm with one or the other of my groups.
Aspiring writer.
And then there's the free writing fools, as we call ourselves. 8 writers who meet twice a month in Denver in an art studio, and we write for 8 minutes at a time from a prompt that anybody throws out. This week we wrote about flashlights, we wrote about the word late, and we wrote about 2 little photographs that a woman had found in a box. You remember photo booths?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I guess they still have them some places.
Uh-huh.
She didn't know who these people were. We didn't know who they were. But that was one of the prompts. And then we just read and share and maybe talk about it a little bit. That one's not so much critique about the writing as it is just the fun of seeing what 8 people will come up with.
And what you mentioned, practice.
It's practice.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
When we go to your website, you mentioned your website earlier. What all can we find on your website?
Well, the first page, what's called the landing page of my website, is my blog. I blog every Saturday morning, and it's always something about the writing life, as I conceive it. It might be a recommendation of a craft book that I've read. 2 weeks ago, I wrote about being scared to write the blog. That was kind of fun. It just sort of, you know, like I said at the end, it just popped up like a pimple on her chin, you know, because I didn't know what I was going to do. That's the first page. There is the About page, which is basically bio. My publication list is there, which is very useful, by the way, if you get to the point where you're starting to submit things, rather than have to bog down a submission, which with what is by now a fairly lengthy publication list, I can just say, and by the way, if you need to see my publications, you can go here, okay? And then there's a page called the bookshelf, which is all the books and a little blurb and where to get them and that sort of thing. And finally, there's one called Readers Welcome Here. And periodically I change the content there. Sometimes there'll be a poem up, sometimes there'll be a short story up, whatever, okay? So it's a little taste of what I write.
How fun.
Yeah.
You do write a lot, Karen.
I do.
You do.
And in addition, I write morning pages. I get up at 5:30, handwrite 3 pages every day, 365 days a year. I would have to be on my deathbed not to do.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
fabulous. It's
Yeah.
so inspiring to other writers and other people interested in this.
Yeah.
And if people want to contact you for any sort of author events or even some teaching, they could contact you through your website also?
They could do that. Also, my Amazon authors page has a contact option. And I think the Goodreads page, now I must confess I've been a little lax about Goodreads because I got kind of busy over the summer.
Sure.
But Goodreads does have an authors page also. Social media is really something that writers need to figure out and deal with somehow.
Yes.
You can go crazy.
Yes.
You can be
and
overwhelmed.
it can be overwhelmed. I was going to say
Absolutely.
overwhelmed.
You pick a few that you can do well and that you like to do. Yeah, I like writing the blog. It's very freeing because it's a mini essay every week. You know.
Well, someone who's
it's only like
you've got to write. It sounds like here.
Yeah. It's only usually I limit it to about 300 words. You can do that in your sleep.
Well, you can, Karen. You can do it in your sleep.
You can learn. You can learn.
Well, let me ask you my favorite final question to ask authors. What are you working on next?
Oh, I'm deep in the throes of the sequel to Accidental Child.
Okay, fabulous.
Readers have complained because They want to know what happened to some of the characters.
That's a wonderful complaint,
It is a wonderful complaint. And this one is challenging me in ways I never thought I would allow. Accidental child is first person, present tense, very close point of view. I always had my focus on Rose, the main character. I now have 3 main characters. I don't know yet what sequence they're going to show up in. And I'm not exactly sure where they're going to end up, but I have enough of an idea that I can go from A to Z.
Well, that sounds like a big project, but
It is.
I have complete faith in you.
Thank you.
That you will get that thing written, because you just are so prolific. And in between that and your sequel, probably another poetry book, maybe.
Actually, yeah, I have a poetry book sitting on the shelf. I actually have another novel sitting on the shelf that is done. It's very different from Accidental Child, so I've kind of been holding off on it because I want to get the sequel done and get those 2 tidied up. And then maybe I'll think about Invisible and get that out.
That's so exciting, and congratulations on being writing full-time and just enjoying that and getting all those words out.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to thank my guest today, Karen Douglas, for having her wonderful array of books and talking about them all so beautifully. Check your local libraries for all of Karen's books, and join us for more next time on Off the Page.